Poverty and homelessness is a widespread issue across Canada and all over the world. Largely, youth are being affected at high rates. Our presentation will be looking at poverty and homelessness affecting youth in Canada. We will also discuss how poverty intersects with other sociocultural factors. Specifically, we will be analyzing poverty and homelessness through the lens of a child with exceptionalities and how this further affects their experiences within education and the school context. To start off, we will be defining a few key terms and discussing the readings by Bayat and Clauda to further our knowledge on poverty, trauma, and labeling. So, what is poverty? Poverty is when an individual lacks a usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. Poverty exists when individuals lack the means to satisfy their basic needs of survival or a certain standard of living. Precarious employment has increased by 50% over the last decade within Canada, therefore increasing the chance for poverty and youth living under the poverty line. Families are considered to be living in poverty if their pre-tax income is less than the federal poverty level, which is an income threshold that varies by family size and composition. To provide an example, for Canada, the official poverty line for a family of 2 adults and 2 children averages to be $37,542. Children and youth under 18 are particularly vulnerable to conditions of poverty. In fact, 1.3 million children live in conditions of poverty in Canada alone. That works out to be about 1 in 5. Children make up about 19% of the poverty population in Canada, and children in lone parent families make up about 47%. This could be due to the fact that single-parent households have to provide for the family on the basis of one income, which is increasingly more difficult. Therefore, children living in single-family homes are more likely to be living in poverty. Next, we will be defining homelessness in the context of youth. A homeless child is any child who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. The homeless youth population not only includes youth living on the street, but also includes children that couch hop, youth aging out of foster care, and throwaway youth. Couch hopping is a child that lives in unstable living conditions where survival skills are used to attain temporary housing and the child is moving from place to place, usually in someone's home temporarily, sleeping on a couch or often the floor. Aging out are youth that turn 18 that have been served in the foster care system and are considered and expected to be on their own now. Throwaways are youth that are forced to leave home by their parents, either kicked out or disowned. As educators, it is our job to know our students and their situations to provide them with an equitable learning experience in the classroom. Some signs of homelessness in youth is wearing the same clothes often, being late to school, lacking school supplies completely, homework being incomplete, and the child expressing disinterest and not wanting to go home. Although these are indicators, some of the above signs overlap with signs of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. It is important educators are able to differentiate, although abuse, neglect, and abandonment can be overlapping effects of homelessness. Often, students coping with the stress of being homeless exhibit 2 types of behavior: withdrawal and depression, or acting out through aggressive or inappropriate behavior. This is important for teachers to notice as they have to adapt their expectations and make accommodations for these students based on their circumstances and lived experiences. Teachers must pay attention to these things. It can become problematic if a child's behavior is being exhibited due to them being homeless, and the teacher sees it as problematic and does not provide that child with extra supports that they need, not only within the classroom, but also outside of school. This could cause the child to become labeled incorrectly as mischievous and further marginalize them within their education, therefore not allowing for proper development due to the negligence of the educator. Moving forward, trauma is also discussed frequently within the Bayat article in relation to poverty and homelessness. Trauma is the response to a deeply disturbing or distressing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. This causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self, and their ability to feel a full range of experiences and emotions. Some emotional signs of trauma include sadness, anger, fear, and shame. These emotions can lead to nightmares, emotional outbursts, and trouble sleeping. Later on, these can manifest themselves into psychological disorders such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, and dissociative disorders. The trauma that a child experiences through homelessness and poverty may not necessarily be a physical trauma. However, if a child is worrying about where they may sleep every night, this can cause immense stress on the child and create anxiety. These types of emotional traumas are very intense for children who are in their prime age of development and discovering their identities as youth and eventually young adults. When poverty and homelessness are intertwined, there tends to show a high likelihood of past trauma affecting the youth later on in life. Next, I will be overviewing and discussing the two articles that we chose to analyze and use as a foundation for our assignment. These articles are the Bayat article called Children with Challenging Behaviors and Their Early Education, and the Clouda article called The Power of Labeling. Bayat's article discusses challenging behaviors in children from trauma and their development and education. Firstly, Bayat states, childhood trauma has influence on physical, mental, and behavioral health. This creates a disadvantage to young children because they are unable to express verbally how they feel when they may be anxious, threatened, or helpless. One of the traumas discussed is physical or care neglect, which is the failure to provide safety, food, hygiene, clothing, and shelter to a child. All of these issues are potential effects of poverty or homelessness. Families or caregivers may not have the means to provide their child with these necessities, and therefore these children often experience this form of trauma. In fact, in the U.S., malnutrition and deprivation, which are effects of poverty and homelessness, are considered non-accidental abuses. This has implications for families experiencing poverty, since it can criminalize parents or caregivers for something that may be out of their control. Furthermore, emotional abuse is more prevalent in families who deal with parental mental health issues like depression, or in families with substance abuse problems. However, this can be seen as an issue of intergenerational trauma, where families who live in intergenerational poverty often have trauma and experience these mental health issues. These issues perpetuate themselves as they can be a direct act of experiencing emotional trauma as a child, which creates a vicious cycle for families experiencing poverty and homelessness. It's extremely problematic. Each child will react differently to trauma they may face while homeless or living in poverty, as well as some instances may be more severe than others. It is up to educators to be sensitive to these issues while providing students the appropriate tools within school to be successful. Noticing behaviors and appropriately classifying them and dealing with them in a healthy way that does not further traumatize or victimize the child is important. Teachers still must perceive students living in poverty as able students, able to join the science and math clubs, able to get good grades, and able to improve their quality of life and have successful futures. Trauma is often discussed as having negative consequences for the child, but this is not always the case. Educators must understand that the signs of trauma from homelessness and poverty to ensure that they are dealt with properly so the child isn't marginalized further within their education. The next article that will be discussed is The Power of Labeling, Poverty as a Spectator Sport by Clouda, written in 2015. This article focuses on the power of labeling in terms of poverty and homelessness and the effects that this has on children. Firstly, Clouda asserts that labeling poverty is problematic. The different labels and categories applied to people and their situation in terms of the poorest, most marginalized, or least powerful reflects a variety of interests hidden in the idea of compassion, and that unless there be clarity concerning the endpoint of this compassion, there is little point in arguing about labels. These labels create categories which are centered on certain individuals' interests and what they want to achieve. Clouda believes that individuals and governments have motives in terms of labeling and asking questions about poverty, marginalization, or rights. This is problematic because this approach asserts that there is a unified way to address the issue of poverty, when that is simply not the case. Clouda asserts that there is a huge diversity when it comes to the types of poverty, inequality, and injustices that people face. Therefore, society has to acknowledge that because there is an array of different situations, there is a multiplicity of approaches, motivations, and end goals. Furthermore, the problem of chronic illness and disability is very strongly associated with poverty. This is because the amount of time that has to be devoted to the care of the person concerned, as well as because that person finds it hard or impossible to work or to interact with others. Cloudis states that although in some situations persons with disabilities are supported, it completely depends on the community's perspectives of that person and if they have been fulfilling their obligations to the community, and if they are a kind person. Therefore, the support of the community is based on human interactions and the perception of those interactions. This can be problematic for people living in poverty, as normally they are streamlined into low-income neighborhoods where the people around them are also living in poverty, making it difficult to be supported either financially or psychologically. In addition, this is problematic for individuals with exceptionalities because they can be seen as lacking social skills, and people in the community may perceive them as different or inferior, and therefore their interactions can be negative and they will not receive the support they need from their community members. Poverty is a large contributor to the intensification of exceptionalities and antisocial behaviors. As educators, we have to reduce the impact of these factors. Therefore, we must be aware of how poverty is intertwined into a child's education to create an equitable space for the child to succeed and learn meaningfully.